Hello everyone, welcome to a special request of a video. Now this isn't going to interfere with my plans. Any requests for videos are going to go on top of what I normally would approach with. So in this particular case we have a request by, very specifically, Zanette's Place, who wanted me to talk about a Pierce conversion infiltrator. Now, I'm going to have to clarify a couple of things first. One, this is going to be broken up into predominantly 3 videos, each discussing 3 specific ways I'm really fond of building a Pierce conversion infiltrator. 2, I am assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, I am assuming that Zanette's Place is converting into Pierce. Alright, with that being said, my preferred way of running a Pierce conversion infiltrator, and you'll see the hallmarks of my usual favorite builds here if you've followed my hardcore playthroughs before, or actually any of my playthroughs. You'll know what I'm referencing in a bit, but my usual go-to Pierce infiltrator runs off of Messenger's Repeater, because it offers you a lot of things that you really want. Now, whatever else you have equipped is fine, right? But Messenger's Repeater is key for 2 reasons. 1, Word of Pain does 100% piercing damage and reduces enemy pierce resistance. 2, Veil of Shadow, as long as that's on and you are equipped with Messenger's Repeater, 100% of cold damage is converted to piercing damage with Veil of Shadow, okay? This, for a Pierce conversion build, is gross. Let me show you why. Now, before we actually get into the meat of this, though, let me talk about conversion builds in general. Now, if you've followed my Grim Dawn content, which I've unfortunately been not as diligent with, that is on me, not you, and I apologize, but if you've been following my Grim Dawn content, you know that I am a really big proponent of 2 damage type builds, because as you can even see here with the Messenger's Repeater, we are seeing an increase in pierce and bleeding damage. Most skills in the game deal at least 2 types of damage, right? It's just incredibly easy to build 2 different damage types. But if you're running a conversion build, a lot of the times it's possible, for one reason or another, to be able to almost exclusively focus on whatever that damage type is. Because a lot of equipment that converts damage, either for a specific skill or for something in general, right, is going to be also reducing resistances in some way. And you're going to see a hell of a lot of that in this build. We're still going to be incorporating bleed damage, but not through skills so much as our constellations. We'll talk about it. But when I am talking about this build, be aware that I am talking about this weapon. It is also really important to note that this conversion here, 40 to 60% of elemental damage converted to piercing damage, this is elemental damage slapped onto the Messenger's Repeater. You see it does physical damage here, right? Now I want you to also understand something else. Actually, there's a couple of things. First off, this only exists on ranged weapons, or actually weapons in general, physical weapons, right? There is no need for armor piercing on elemental damage weapons. The point of this, the 40 to 60% of elemental damage converted to piercing damage, is very specifically if you attached a component onto this, or you used a skill that tacks onto your auto attack damage or weapon damage in some way, that damage would be converted to piercing, right? This isn't converting all elemental damage you do while armed with this weapon. If you use a skill that does not factor your weapon at all into it, this elemental damage conversion isn't affecting that skill. I will give you an example in a very short bit, but keep in mind that this elemental damage conversion is for this weapon's attacks. Unlike Veil of Shadow, which as long as Veil of Shadow is on, all of your cold damage is converted to piercing damage. As long as you have Messenger's Repeater equipped, all of the elemental damage of Word of Pain is converted to piercing damage. We'll talk about this right now. Now, the first thing you should know with this combination is that just like with the Demolitionist Soldier combination, because Nightblade doesn't have any kind of ultimate skill here, we don't necessarily need to, and in most cases are not looking to max the Nightblade side of this. The Nightblade side of this is primarily for extra support, okay? And that is where we're going to be approaching this from. And in fact, with a ranged, as it would probably make sense to you, with a ranged piercing build, we are relying extremely heavily on Inquisitor for a fascinating number of reasons. But let's talk about early game. Now, early game, what you want right off the top is Word of Pain. There are a handful of reasons for this. There is one exception. Let me get into that. Word of Pain is great because you press the button, boom, there's the words. Hovering over the heads of your enemies, damaging them over time. Second great benefit for the early game is that this is two different damage types. This is fire and cold. In the early game of Grim Dawn, if an enemy is going to be resistant to a damage type, it is only going to be that damage type, that one damage type in most cases. And that damage type is typically the damage type they're also dealing. Usually. Not always, but that's the general rule of thumb that you can live by. Write that down, kids. So if you come up against a fire element hero that just pops out of the blue and starts slapping you in the face with fire damage, you can still use Word of Pain on him because while he'll resist the fire damage, sure, he's not going to be resisting the cold damage. Right? He's a fire element hero in the early game. Later on in the game, this doesn't hold true, but by that point, we're converting this to piercing anyways. Doesn't matter. Alright? Now, that is that benefit there. This also holds particularly true if you're running a mod that increases enemy stat numbers, because they're going to be even more resistant to that given element, whether it's fire or cold, doesn't matter. So it's even more important in a mod that increases enemy stat numbers for that reason. Furthermore, the second major benefit here compared to the other possible contender, very specifically Amarasta's Blade Burst, which I'm going to max here just for comparison's sake really quick. Word of Pain reduces enemy attack by 22% for 1 second each time they're hit. Alright, and they get hit 8 times. So that slower attack lasts for 8 seconds. 9 seconds, actually, in realistic application. Assuming you don't refresh it, right? Which, obviously, since it happens in a second and does not have any kind of cooldown, you can do that. And it's nasty. But anyways, this is a guaranteed slower enemy attack. In hardcore, this is useful. You're taking less damage. Increased enemy stat numbers. They're hitting harder. Take less damage. Great. Increased enemy groups. More enemies attacking you slower is the same thing as fewer enemies attacking you at normal speed, so it all balances out in the end, you're taking less damage. Nightblade. Even at max level, Amarasta's Blade Burst only has a 25% chance to freeze the target. Okay? Which is a bit problematic. You're not guaranteed to freeze the target. But this is also a ranged build. While you may not necessarily start the game off with a ranged build, depending on how lucky you are with your early drops or how prepared you are, maybe you brought in weapons or whatever. With a ranged weapon, and this is not necessarily widely known, long-time Nightblade players will know this, but if you're new to the Nightblade, you might not know this. Amarasta's Blade Burst operates differently for ranged weapons. For melee weapons, Amarasta's Blade Burst is slap, there's the Blade Burst. For ranged weapons, you're actually firing what would better be described as an Amarasta's Blade Shot. It shoots out a special bullet that triggers the skill when it hits the target. Or triggers when it hits any viable target. You'll notice my change in wording. This is because, lo and behold, if you're trying to shoot, say, a hero with Amaras's Blade Burst with a ranged weapon, and a flunky intercepts the shot far enough away from the hero that he doesn't even get hit by it, you've just wasted your Amaras's Blade Burst. Yeah, sure, it's got a 1.5 second recharge. But what if that was the freeze shot? What if that was the shot you needed to freeze the hero to take less damage and not take an absolutely disgustingly large amount of damage, right? What if this keeps happening? Alright. Reanimators are a pain, by the way, with this. So for a ranged build, even in the early game, I generally stay away from Amaras's Blade Burst. It tends to be unreliable, not in terms of its damage. Obviously, it slaps. It's doing 180% weapon damage, and we're running a two-handed gun at some point here, right? We're obviously going to be hitting hard with this thing. Whereas the Word of Pain is not scaling with our weapon. In the early game, that doesn't really matter, but in the late game, it won't matter for different reasons. But this, we can't guarantee is going to hit our target at range. Something could jump in between and intercept the shot. And for heroes or bosses that are really fond of flunkies, this is very difficult to use effectively in those situations. Okay? So for a ranged build, I recommend against Amaras's Blade Burst. There are other reasons I'm not fond of this we'll talk about later on, but I wouldn't start with this. I would start with Word of Pain. First, we want it later on. Second, it does get around cold-resistant enemies, which Amaras's Blade Burst only really does if your weapon isn't also cold. If you have a cold weapon and you're using Amaras's Blade Burst in the early game, you might have some trouble if you're unlucky with what heroes jump you. But Word of Pain, great start. Next, we are going to be looking at ranged expertise. We get some bonus flat piercing damage, we get a 50% increase to pierce damage, we get increased attack speed. The elemental damage doesn't matter, we're converting that. But in the early game, at the very least, we get that pierce damage, we get that flat pierce, we get that increased attack speed. Really nice to have, we love to see it. For Nightblade, we really aren't doing too much. We don't need Veil of Shadow until we get Messenger's Repeater. Now, you're probably wondering, well, Professor, this is required player level 94. Alright, we're not getting that for a while, but Messenger's Repeater drops at 20, 40, 55, 70, 84, and 94. Now, it obviously drops from Akaloth the Messenger. He is very obviously in a late game area, right? This is the Pit of Atonement, which is in the late game. This is in the remnants of Corvan City, right? This is really late in the DLC. You can get here early. You can actually theoretically fight your way here after killing Krieg, technically. It's not easy, but you can do it. And the levels get interesting. The enemy levels get interesting when you do it that early, but you can work your way here early, because you don't actually need to kill Korvac for this. You just need to work your way here, and then go into the correct dungeon, right? Which is the Pit of Atonement, which is this one right here, right? So, it is possible, but just you have that awareness, and this is the reason I like green weapons. There's two reasons I prefer green weapons and green equipment over blue and purple. Alright, this is the big reason why I prefer this build over the ones we'll be talking about in the next two videos. The Messenger's Repeater not only can scale with you if you're diligent about farming this off the Messenger, but on top of that, as a green weapon, it can drop with extra prefixes and suffixes. These prefixes and suffixes can, say, increase your pierce damage further. They can increase specific skills even further. By default, it increases Death Sentence and Night's Chill by 4 each, but you get the right prefix or suffix, that goes higher. We've got all kinds of lovely things that can be tacked onto this that can make it even more powerful. This is just baseline. you can get any, at minimum, 2 bonus stats. Okay? At a minimum. That's why I like this. That's one of the big reasons I like this. But I just wanted to make that very clear here. So back to the Messenger's Repeater here, right? So we're not pulling anything from Nightblade yet. You want to put the 1 point in here so it doesn't keep harassing you about picking your second mastery, which is just an annoyance. Put the 1 point in it. You know you're going to be a Nightblade anyways, right? You're on an Infiltrator video. You know you're going to be an Infiltrator. That's why you're here. So put the 1 point in it. But for now, we're largely going to ignore Nightblade, at least for the short term. What we're really going to be looking for is a lot of Inquisitor stuff. Now, you're going to want to go up, a little too far, up to 5, and you're going to want to put points in Rune of Hagrad. You might be wondering, well, Professor, why Rune of Hagrad specifically? If you were paying attention to what I was talking about with the Veil of Shadow before, you will probably have already figured out that the cold damage is a 100% conversion when we have the Messenger's Repeater equipped and we have Veil of Shadow active. In other words, Rune of Hagrad becomes 100% pierce damage. 100%. Furthermore, with a ranged build, this is really, really nice because you can put these between you and the enemy, and when the melee enemies come crawling to you trying to take you out, bam! Rune of Hagrad in the face. 100% pierce damage, scaling off of player bonuses, meaning all of your pierce damage increases affect your runes. You are blasting melee people in the face with icicles of piercing death. Okay? Later on. This is ugly. This is gross. Everyone should do this. You want this. This Stormbox, this is lightning damage. It also doesn't touch our weapon damage. This does. Bursting Round does. And sure, if we were to slap points in this, some of that fire damage would convert. Very true. Because the fun thing about elemental conversion, which not a lot of people talk about, is that is all 3 elements. You see, elemental damage technically is actually 3 different damage types happening at the same time, divided as evenly as possible. If you did exactly 99 elemental damage, 33 of that would actually be fire, 33 of that would be lightning, and 33 of that would be ice, specifically. The internal weights beyond that, I'm not sure of. For example, if you did exactly 100 elemental damage, which one of those 3 gets the bonus 1 damage, I don't know. But approximately speaking, give or take a percentage either way, depending on the distribution, the internal weights, you're doing approximately 33% of each of the 3 elements, fire, ice, lightning. But when it comes to conversion, that conversion affects all 3 elements. Period, full stop, no questions asked. If you're converting 40% of your elemental damage, you are converting all fire damage at 40%, all lightning damage at 40%, and all ice damage at 40%. The catch here is that this is still only 40 to 60. So when we run, say, Bursting Round, the thing is that this is activating off of default weapon attacks, which is why it's affected by this. Okay, that's the difference here. This activates off of default weapon attacks. This does not. This is not affected by the Messenger's Repeater's conversion. Okay? Because this isn't doing anything with default weapon attacks. But this is. But only 40 to 60% of that fire damage is converting. So it's not actually worth it. We will, in future, absolutely be wanting Chilling Round for the exact same reason we want Rune of Hagrad. All this cold and frostburn damage, that's all going to convert to pierce damage. Well, the frostburn damage doesn't, but the cold damage sure does, and we're going to want that. So we will be picking up Chilling Rounds later on, but because this isn't being 100% converted like Chilling Rounds is, Bursting Round isn't as worth it. Furthermore, this is physical damage, not piercing damage, so even then we're not even getting that much either here. But Chilling Rounds is pierce and cold, so this becomes 100% pierce, other than the frostburn damage on this side, which is fine. So, that's where we go here. And at this point, actually, no, not quite yet. At this point, we start making choices. At least after Word of Agony, which we are absolutely going to want. Alright, you're decreasing enemy health regeneration, you're impairing their aim, you're getting more damage on here. Again, this is still likely, unless you did what I talked about earlier, where you, after Krieg, just ran to go get a Messenger's Repeater, which, again, you absolutely can do. Unless you ran and got that, this is just bonus elemental damage. If you did go and get that, now we're doing even more piercing damage, because all three of those elements are converting. Obviously, the fire and cold percentage increases don't affect it, obviously, but the lightning damage becomes piercing damage. In both of these damages, the fire and cold here, these both become piercing damage as well. So we get that, but now we have choices. You can pick up Deadly Aim if you want. There are reasons you will want it, but I'm going to talk about that later on. For now, it's nice to have, but you don't need it. And then my preference between the two healing for this build is Word of Renewal. There are a couple of really specific reasons for this. Okay? The first one is, since we already want to eventually go all the way up to at least chilling rounds anyways, we're going to be going by Word of Arms on our way there. And Word of Arms requires a two-handed weapon. Melee or ranged doesn't matter. We're running the Messenger's Repeater, a two-handed gun. We get 4 fewer seconds on our recharge for this, bringing our recharge down to 8 seconds, and we get bonus 4% health healing, and on top of that, our energy regeneration is boosted by a quarter. Lovely. On top of that, of course, we get increased defensive ability, we get the total health restored, by the way, is... Does it factor this in? It does not. Okay. I keep forgetting if Grim Tools does that or not. So we're getting 22% of our health plus an additional flat 850. And we get increased movement speed. In comparison, let's just boost up to Pneumatic Burst here. We get 14 total speed, which does increase our attack speed, which is really nice, and we are restoring 34% of our health, which is nice, and we are getting increased offensive ability and an equivalent 8-second skill recharge. But we don't get the energy, we don't get the defensive ability, and while we are attacking faster, at the end of the day, there are benefits to Vigor that I prefer in a lot more situations, because you see, well, it to some small extent is going to be a bit of a matter of personal preference. Let me put it this way. We're going to ignore Elemental Awakening because we'd only really be getting elemental resistance out of this. Alright, let me put this out here right now. In a Pierce Conversion Infiltrator, Elemental Awakening is just giving you weak frostburn damage and an elemental resistance boost. Alright, which is not worth the 17 additional mastery points plus the points invested into Elemental Awakening in the first place. It's not worth it. If you are going to go into Pneumatic Burst, you're at most going to stop at Shadow Dance, which reduces your entrapment duration and gives you a chance to avoid projectiles and gives you defensive ability. Whereas the second stage of Word of Renewal gives you Vigor, which gives you increased health and reduces your freeze, petrify, and entrapment duration. I don't usually go into Steel Resolve because this isn't giving us anything we need either. It's giving us Aether and Chaos resistance and increased damage to Chthonics and Eldritch. We aren't really looking for the physical damage, we aren't looking for the elemental damage, and we aren't looking for the internal trauma damage. I prefer Word of Renewal very specifically because it is easier to stay alive. Chthonics and Eldritch are very common enemy types, specifically the Chthonics. The Eldritch happen less frequently. They're more in the DLC than anything else. They kick around in a couple of other places, right? But they're still decently around. This gives you a bit more attack speed at the cost of some movement speed increase. Doesn't give you the energy increase. Heals more in health percentage-wise, but doesn't give you a flat health restore. And it increases your offensive ability. It's your choice between the two, but given how often use slap down runes and words of pain and agony and death and destruction, the energy regeneration actually comes in handy a lot of the times. Again, I prefer Word of Renewal because I'm already here with a two-handed weapon. We take less damage from people. This is a bit more defensive, alright? This is a decent bit more defensive. Nightblade is a bit more offensive. Even with Shadow Dance, it has a little bit more emphasis on that offense, right? We have a chance to dodge projectiles, but we're talking about better attack speed at the sacrifice of some movement speed, so we're not dodging as well, but we're attacking a little faster. We get that increased offensive ability. Healing is slightly better on this. It's a personal preference thing, alright? Choose the one you like more, but don't bother with the third one of either. Don't bother with Steel Resolve if you're going Word of Renewal. Don't bother with Elemental Awakening if you're going Pneumatic Burst. Stop at the second stage. You really don't need anything more than that. And besides, for the Infiltrator, we really don't want to progress past this point anyways. I'll talk about why in just a little bit, but this is as far as we will ever want to be going into for the Nightblade for a ranged Pierce conversion build. So, I'm going to stick with the Word of Renewal because, again, it is my personal preference, but do just kind of bookmark that Pneumatic Burst is a nicer option if you want the better offense. Personally, if you're playing hardcore or you're playing literally any modded version of this game, Word of Renewal is probably going to be a little bit better for you. It is slightly more defensive. It is going to help you stay alive better. In the base game, no mods, no hardcore, Pneumatic Burst is probably slightly more effective. Specifically for the offensive ability, that becomes really handy to have later on. But for all non-base game, I would more heavily recommend Word of Renewal. But with that being said, here we are here. We get these, right? We obviously want Biting Cold. We're increasing our pierce damage with this. We're getting slower enemy attack, which we want. Chilling rounds, of course. Lovely. Freeze targets, please. And at this point, you want to go to here, and then you want to break the game, grab Veil of Shadow, max Night's Chill. Now, I made a bold statement just there. Break the game. What do I mean? Well, if you... pardon me. If you've played Pierce Conversion Infiltrator before, you probably know where I'm about to go with this. If you haven't, hold on to your butts. Now, first off, it is worth reinforcing a further decrease of enemy pierce resistance on Word of Pain when armed with Messenger's Repeater. In fact, this happens at the base part of Word of Pain, so as long as you have Messenger's Repeater, that's attached to this first part, alright? But when we get all the way to Death Sentence, you'll notice we get additional pierce resistance and elemental damage, which, by the way, is getting converted to pierce. By itself, once we hit Death Sentence, this ability alone is reducing enemy pierce resistance by 35%. Okay? Which is already really impressive. That's a third of their pierce resistance gone. Night's Chill, a further 25% pierce resistance reduction. Yes, we are in fact reducing enemy pierce resistance in melee range by 60% total. Now, you might have, if you, again, have watched my content before, you know probably what I'm about to say. You're probably having Demolitionist flashbacks. With this build, I like to go melee ranged weapon. I run up on them, and I shoot them square in the face. Well, bosses at least. I don't usually go melee range with hordes, because I want to use Rune of Hagarad effectively. I use that as a buffer between me and large groups of enemies, but for one-on-one fights with strong enemies, I'm going melee. I'm running up to their face, I'm getting that Night's Chill in there, I'm doing that pierce damage per second with that cold damage being converted, and I'm slapping them down with 60% pierce resistance reduction. But it gets better. It gets really zoomed in for some reason. I know why, but... Crossroads. Put this in Assassin's Blade. Stick it on. Very specifically. Rune of Hagrad. Okay? Or... you can stick it on Chilling Rounds. Entirely possible. It's really up to you. I prefer Rune of Hagrad because I also get to proc this on enemies as well. More often, there's 5 projectiles at minimum coming out of Rune of Hagrad, so that's more likely to trigger an Assassin's Mark. I don't necessarily have better control over who gets it, but it happens. Right? This doesn't have an internal cooldown, so there's not like any kind of limit on the number of Assassin's Marks you can have kicking around. They last 18 seconds, but there's no recharge time, so you can actually theoretically proc a bunch of these at the same time. It does run on critical attack, right? It runs on your critical chance. Which now you're probably linking back to the offensive ability conversation I was having earlier. Now you're understanding. Yes, the offensive ability of Pneumatic Burst increases your likelihood of getting crits. Yes, that is why sometimes your personal preference might be Pneumatic Burst. I understand that. But let's go back to talking about this. This is another 32% pierce resistance reduction, on top of the 60% we were already reducing. In other words, when you proc an Assassin's Mark, and you are in melee range of a target with Word of Pain on them, you're reducing their pierce resistance by 92%. Yeah. Welcome to the glory of conversion builds. This is why people love them. This is the predominant reason we want Infiltrator. This is the predominant reason we want Death Sentence. At this particular point, the world is your oyster. And what you do with your remaining skill points is entirely between you and whatever demon you've made a pact with. However, let's talk about a few other really fun facts. First off, I am very fond of Deadly Aim because, of course, when we get our first crit, we get an 18% increase in our offensive ability, which, hey, is just more crits. More likelihood of getting crits. Now, while this won't auto-refresh Deadly Aim because it has a 5-second recharge, obviously, it does mean that once we trigger Deadly Aim and while we're under its effects, over the next 5 seconds, we are having a higher than average, well, higher than previous, chance of getting crits, which means we can proc Assassin's Mark more often once this triggers. Obviously a good thing. So we want this. This is great. We love this. But wait, there's more. Now, what I'm really fond of doing is blasting all the way up to the end of Inquisitor and grabbing Chill Surge. You don't necessarily need Chill Surge, alright? I like it personally, but it's not strictly necessary. There is extra projectiles here, which is just more opportunities for blasting fools with pierce damage, which is primarily why I grabbed this. Also, a 43% chance of freezing people. While it's not guaranteed, with 8 projectiles, because keep in mind, this is already launching out 5 by itself. This is an additional 3. That's 8 waves of icicles bursting out, potentially freezing, absolutely hitting like a steam train of pierce damage. Increased chances of getting crits. The more projectiles, the more damage. The more damage you're doing, or the more hits you're inflicting, I guess you would say, the more likely one of those hits is going to be a crit, which we want. So I'm fond of this. But again, nice to have, but optional. What I also like grabbing is Horn of Gandar, because this is 100% pierce damage, reduces targets' damage, and confuses them for the better part of that. If not all of that. Really low recharge of 4.5 seconds. Well, considerably low. And this makes for a great backup plan for a ranged Pierce Conversion Infiltrator. You're surrounded by enemies, your runes have failed you somehow, things are looking ugly, blast them in the face with a doot-doot. Suddenly they're confused, they've just taken a huge amount of pierce damage directly to the face, and those ones that shake off the confusion early are still not hitting you as hard for the next couple of seconds. This is almost a necessity in hardcore or any mod that increases enemy group numbers, because you're going to get surrounded damn quick, and this is going to save your life a lot in those situations. So in hardcore and in any mod increasing enemy group numbers, you gotta get this. Otherwise, it's just a really great thing to have. I also tend to grab Aura of Conviction, primarily for the offensive ability and the further increase in pierce damage, right? Great. At this point, we have 4 points. I tend to slap these just randomly into Phantasmal Armor, right? You could, if you really wanted to, throw them into Steel Resolve if you really wanted. That would be fine. Maybe you want to do Artifact Handling just so you have a bit faster of a Rune of Hagarad. That's totally acceptable as well. Not really a bad thing, right? You're getting a little bit of a faster recharge here. You're going from 4 to 3.3, right? You're doing a little bit more damage with that, which can be really nice. If you prefer this over Chill Surge, or at least maybe you prefer more of this over Chill Surge, you can absolutely do that as well. Maybe you do Chill Surge to some extent for the bonus projectiles, the better freeze. Maybe you only put in specifically 5 points, right? Who knows? Maybe you really like that, but why not put in all the 6 anyways? So you get 2 projectiles here, you get increased 12% damage, bonus crit damage, your recharge is now down to 2.5 seconds for the runes. Another very viable option. Totally a great choice as well. I prefer the 3 projectiles, but if you prefer the shorter cooldowns, that is also very effective. But you might be wondering, oh, Professor, you seem to have skipped 2 potentially very nice skills. You seem to have passed over Amarasta's Blade Burst when you talked about it as potentially being useful in the early game, and you've totally ignored Phantasmal Blades, the de facto Pierce Bleed skill. There are reasons for that, as you probably suspected. The reason why I've skipped over these, well, I've already covered my problems with Amarasta's Blade Burst, especially when you compare it to Rune of Hagarad. Alright? Secondarily, the second stage of this Lethal Assault does not a lot for you. Yeah, that cold damage is being converted to pierce damage, which isn't bad, but that acid damage, you're not doing anything with. Right? That does nothing for you. Yeah, it's internally increasing itself, but it's the only thing increasing itself. And furthermore, you're getting bonus cold damage as well. But you're not doing cold damage. You're converting all of your cold damage. Right? By the way, if you wanted to take 6 points out of Veil of Shadow and put them into Chill Surge, that's fine. I just really like the decrease in enemy speed because it makes, combined with Horn of Gandar, that's just crippling for any enemies in melee range. But anyways, that's a different conversation. But yeah, Lethal Assault does so little for you, it's not worth the investment, and you're just left with, while it's powerful, sure, it does less for you than Rune of Hagarad will do. It's a single shot compared to the multiple projectiles, which pierce through enemies and can keep on going and therefore theoretically hit multiple enemies. And while the burst itself can hit multiple enemies, again, if the wrong enemy intercepts the shot, you're not hitting your intended targets. So for ranged, again, I just recommend staying away from this. We're also ranged, so we don't need Phantasmal Blades. I pick up Phantasmal Blades for the melee versions of this, which I'll talk about in the next 2 videos. And that's where I really rely heavily on Phantasmal Blades, but for a ranged build, we really don't need these. Alright, we already have ranged, and you'll see even more in the Devotion, where we have better options for this anyways. So I don't really generally pick up Phantasmal Blades with the ranged build. It's just not worth it a lot of times. It's much more worth it with the melee, where we need the ranged ability to compensate for the fact that we don't have any default ranged options. But as a build using a ranged weapon, while yes, it is true that I tend to run up in the faces of heroes and bosses to get that extra Chill Surge pierce resistance down, in group settings, I'm staying at range. So I just don't find it that useful, right? And again, Flames of Ignifar isn't going to convert. Neither is Rune of Callistor, right? Inquisitor Seal isn't converting. Well, yeah, it has the Rebuke. Aura of Censure isn't converting. Well, the fire damage is, but the burn damage isn't. And even then, this just increases our pierce. This gives us the increased offensive ability. This is just far better, right? Also, by the way, you can take out some of the points for this to go into Chill Surge as well if you want, or to put them into Artifact Handling if you really want. That also works. But again, that's down to your personal preferences. But let's talk about the devotions at this point, because there's something else here that we really need to talk about. Blade Barrier, you might want to stretch the points to get to in Hardcore. Maybe. A lot of the times, while it can save you in the short term, you already have a healing skill, either a Pneumatic Burst or Word of Renewal. And to be quite honest, it's not directly healing you, it's just increasing your health regeneration. Granted, it does increase your health regeneration by a lot, but it's just, anytime I've used this, I've always felt like a sitting duck, and I tend to just die right afterwards anyways, because it doesn't actually solve the problem in a lot of situations. We're not running a retaliation build, so that physical damage retaliation, let's actually go on ahead and really quickly, I just want to talk about this for a bit. Right? This physical damage retaliation, that's 1040 sounds like a lot, but in the late game that really isn't that much. The healing can be nice, but it's only for 3 seconds, and it's not percentage based, right? So it's just not worth it a lot of times. It's not worth the investment, right? Because you're going at least 5 more points in the mastery bar on top of the points you're putting into Blade Barrier in the next place. I just generally don't recommend this. It's not worth the investment. Ring of Steel, while it could be nice, pales in comparison to the glory of Horn of Gandar. Yes, both are pierced, or pierced damage, but we're already on our way to Aura of Conviction anyways, because this is just a huge boost in our pierced damage, and even more importantly, our offensive ability. So on the way, we grab Horn of Gandar. So anytime you would want Ring of Steel, Horn of Gandar is equally, if not more effective. Alright? This is also a much smaller target area, and you cannot increase that by leveling it up. 4.5 compared to the 10 meters of Horn of Gandar, so Horn of Gandar is more useful for the ranged characters because that is a much larger area around you that it's covering, alright? So I don't generally recommend it, but what you want to do with these points is totally up to you. You want to go full artifact handling? Great. You want to go full deadly aim? Great. If you want to lose some points in deadly aim and go into chill surge, totally fine. Mix and match these three according to your preferences, alright? Or pull some points out of Veil of Shadow if you really want. But now let's talk devotions. Now I've already talked about Assassin's Blade and how significantly important that is, right? Another thing I'm really fond of grabbing is actually the Falcons, alright? And I like to slap this onto Word of Pain. The reason why is because this is a 15% chance on attack. Or, to phrase it more accurately, every time Word of Pain deals damage, there is a 15% chance Falcons are going to burst out of your face and hit some people. For reference, this is doing 1 damage every second for 8 seconds by default. You go to Word of Agony, and suddenly, you've got more damage here. But once you hit Death Sentence, that is an additional 4 seconds. Lasts 12 seconds. That is 12 hits, each individual hit on each individual enemy, having a 15% chance of generating Falcons. Falcons deal bleeding damage. Yeah, there's some physical damage there. That's fine. What we're here for is the bleeding damage and Falcons. 6 of them at level 25. Let me just put it this way. You would be stunned. The swarms of Falcons you are going to be emitting at the unholiest of times once you slap a large enough group with Death Sentence, technically. But it gets out of control very quickly. There's a lot that can go on here, okay? It's just a wild time. It really is. So I'm fond of this. Now, where you want to go from here is to give ourselves a particularly interesting time we actually want to get to Harvestman's Scythe, but this is by itself an interesting little adventure. So we are going to pull out our crossroads here. We're going to put it in the blue. Alright? You could go with the lizard. Okay, because what we want is Azraka, very specifically. And I'm really fond of the lizard. Increased health regeneration, some movement speed. Most importantly, healing effects increased, increased health. Absolutely lovely. I adore this. Everyone should have some. Right? Now we need 3 yellow. And there's a couple of options here you can do for the yellow. Alright? I'm fond of the Dryad personally. Right? We get some energy, we get some health. Reduced spirit requirement for jewelry and weapons, which is nice, I guess, to some extent. But we get this really nice heal here, and we can slap this onto Horn of Gandar, which is typically what I slap onto it, because when I'm using Horn of Gandar, I'm probably in a bit of trouble anyways, or, more likely than not, things are starting to turn against me when I have to blast out a horn. And since this hits everyone within a 10-meter radius of you, you're pretty damn near guaranteed to heal yourself off of this. Alright, unless you're using this on specifically, like, a number of enemies you can count on one hand. And in that case, you're probably not in that much trouble in the first place. Okay, unless you're running a mod that increases enemy stats. But this is really nice, because this takes your already emergency weapon of Horn of Gandar and makes it not only as an emergency weapon, but now I'm healing myself off of it. Lovely, lovely time. Really big fan of this. Furthermore, this healing is also affected by the lizard and the Harvestman's Scythe, which increases our healing even further. Right? We get cunning increases, which we want to increase our pierce damage, because that's what that runs off of. And this gives us some purple, which we want for Azraka anyways. Right? Take this point back out, put the point back into the yellow, because now we actually have the yellow we need for this. We need another blue, right? And we need some more purple. Now, you can do the single point here in the blue. We get the blue there. Alright, typically this is what I do. And then we need a little bit more purple. We can get that from here. Alright. You have 2 choices at this point. Specifically 2. You can run the Assassin. This gives you some pierce damage here, cunning and health, offensive ability, a percentage increase in cunning, damage to humans and some poison acid resistance, more pierce damage, and Blades of Wrath. I don't use Blades of Wrath. I have a reason why. Let me get into the first half of that reason. This is 100% chance on critical attack. Blades blast out of you, right? In a circle around you. Which sounds nice, and it is nice. That's a lot of pierce damage, but the amount of times this is actually really useful is not as often as you'd think, because this is just a blanket daggers shooting out of you in a circle. If you really like this compared to what I'll be talking about later, that's fine. But you can do this. If you are going to run the Assassin, you're actually not going to put this point here in the yellow. You're just going to go on ahead and max this guy out. The reason I don't normally do this is because, one, I don't normally go into Blades of Wrath. I don't normally use this. So there's that first off. Second off, we still need 2 purple anyways. So we're still going to be down some purple, regardless of what we do. And a lot of times, whenever I need some bonus purple, I usually go into the Owl. Now, the reason why, additionally, is because the Unknown Soldier typically needs some purple anyways. You'll notice, though, that when we run the Owl here, we're actually at this point here. Anyways, we'll talk about that. We want to increase Azraka, because she's going to give us all this pierce damage. You can see this right here. Right, we have some pierce damage there. We've got some pierce damage here. The physical damage increases our falcons a little bit, but we're already increasing the bleeding on that. That's more important. And Shifting Sands is what I'm really fond of, particularly on hardcore. The reason why is because this has, first off, sand blasting out and hitting people, right? 20% chance on attack, though. Okay? On Rune of Hagarad, and this is one of the reasons why I prefer to max the Chill Surge, the third part of Rune of Hagarad for that third projectile, because each one of those is going to have a chance of proccing Shifting Sand, which is going to go out, blast some fool with some pierce damage, come back, maybe blast him again if they aren't dead yet. It's a lovely time. Everyone loves this. This is what I prefer over the Blades of Wrath. If you're personally more fond of Blades of Wrath, go ham. Use the Blades of Wrath. Not a problem. Pull this out, save a point. Go into this, slap it on Rune of Hagarad. Totally down to your preference. I like Shifting Sands. That's just me. Okay? If you like Blades of Wrath, totally viable. I find them a little less consistent in terms of their usefulness than the Shifting Sands, but that's just, again, me personally. Now, we still need a bit of yellow to get to our friend, the Unknown Soldier. I typically throw it into the Lion, because we get health, we get movement speed, we get some spirit and health, we get plus 15% to our damage. Yes, there's bonuses to pets, that's fine, but we don't actually need to max him out. I, again, don't use Living Shadow here. You're ranged. They only proc on critical attack. Yes, they do impressive amounts of bleeding damage. Yes, they do impressive amounts of pierce damage. And again, if you really like these, you can drop something else for these, whether it's the Falcons or it's the Blades of Wrath, whatever you want, that's fine. I, again, don't personally like these because they spawn next to you and they have to float their way over, and they have a 6-second recharge. And they're based on critical attack. I don't have a problem with each of these individually, but a recharge and a critical attack increase, sure, we have increased offensive ability, but these aren't as... It's not like you're constantly spawning Living Shadows most of the time. There are some situations that can happen, sure, but most of the time you're spawning one or two of these in a fight, and they're still having to travel over to your intended victims. You could use these as a pretty effective barrier against, people coming in at you at melee range. They can, actually, these are fairly effective against anything tougher than the average scrub. If you're facing off against a lot of heroes, or you're having a hard time with the boss, maybe Living Shadows will be the edge you need. But generally, I'm not as fond of these, which you probably know if you've seen my stuff before. I'm just not a huge fan of Living Shadow in general. But now we're kicking around with 5 free points. What do you want to spend them on? Totally depends on your preference. I like Sailor's Guide. We've been playing hardcore. That's a lot of great resistances, right? We have some physique. We have reduced freeze duration, which is a really big deal, right? So I'm rather fond of that. If you want more healing stuff, you can go into the Lotus, increased energy regeneration, health energy vitality resistance, healing effects increased by another 10%. You can get that, right? We have some physical resistance here. You can totally get this, right? You can absolutely do that. Not at all a bad idea. You could go into the Eel, get a little bit of a chance to avoid stuff. The Eel is a little bit better if you're running the Pneumatic Burst, because you're going from 22% dodge chance for range and melee to, when you have the full Eel, a full 24%, so it's just under a quarter of the attacks you're running at. So the Eel is a great option as well. I am pretty fond of the Eel. Really nice pickup here as well, so that's a great option as well. You could additionally go into the Fox if you want to increase the bleed damage on your Falcons and your Sand, because you are doing some bleeding damage here. You've got some Cunning increase, which increases your pierce damage. You've got more bleeding damage here. Right, the Fox is another great option for this, just so you know. And then finally, we of course have, no, not the Crow, the Spider, which is going to give you some general stat upgrades. Right, we have some increased offensive ability. We've got increased attack speed here. We have increased Cunning. We have more Cunning and Spirit. We've got some Spirit here, a more offensive ability. Spider is also not a bad choice either if you really want to do that. You have a lot of, as you can see, you have a lot of great options here. Okay, you could even go into the Harp if you really wanted to. You've got health, you've got pierce and elemental damage, right? You've got resistances and health, you've got more energy, you've got increased pierce damage, increased frostburn damage, which is lovely, inspiration, which I don't ever use, but because I don't often pick up the Harp, and it's only energy regeneration increase. It is reduced entrapment duration, so it actually is pretty nice in hardcore, but there are better options. Like I said, I'm rather fond of the Sailor's Guide for that. And of course, you have the healing, which is reducing your entrapment duration while it's active anyways, but, you know, not a bad option either. You could go into the Harpy, which increases your pierce damage. You're not doing cold damage, so because you're converting that, so there is that downside. That's why I mentioned it last. Not my favorite thing. It is an option. It does increase your pierce damage, but, you know, what you want to use your last 5 points on is totally up to you. But you have a lot of really fantastic options here, right? My top 3, if I had to be pressed for it, would be the Lotus, the Fox, and the Spider are my top 3. Those are generally, one of those 3 is generally where I'm putting those points, or some combination of them, right? If I'm using Pneumatic Burst, Drop Spider in favor of Eel is my 3rd most favorite, but again, that's not as often. And of course, the Hawk, I mean, if you're having a problem with your cunning, the Hawk is an option, but I don't usually have that issue. But that is how I approach a Pierce conversion ranged Infiltrator. There are 2 other variations of this that I like to run. Both are melee. One uses a 2-handed melee, one uses dual wielding. I will talk about both, but that is where I'm going to leave this at for now. So thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me. And have a great 24 hours.